Money is not the problem, chaos is, and that's a far more disturbing realization than most people are willing to tolerate, because it implies that the obstacle between you and financial stability is not some abstract external force like the market, the government, your employer, or even bad luck, but the unstructured, poorly negotiated, and psychologically fragmented state of your own life. When people say they want more money, what they often mean is that they want relief from anxiety, from unpredictability, from the constant low-grade panic that arises when tomorrow feels like a threat instead of an opportunity. But money, properly understood, is not a magical substance that cures fear. It is a representation of order, of stored effort, of negotiated value across time. If your internal world is chaotic, if you wake up at inconsistent hours, if your responsibilities are vague, if your promises to yourself are routinely broken, if you avoid looking at your bank account the same way you avoid looking at an unpleasant truth, then no amount of income will save you. Because whatever enters your life will be consumed by disorder, just as food is consumed by fire. This is why some people earn a great deal and remain perpetually on the edge of collapse, while others with modest means slowly but inexorably build stability. The difference is not intelligence nor even opportunity, but the degree to which they have imposed voluntary structure on their behavior. Financial competence begins where resentment ends, because the moment you decide that your circumstances are entirely someone else's fault, you forfeit the only leverage you actually possess, which is the capacity to regulate your own actions across time. And that capacity is not trivial. It is the very mechanism by which human beings transform chaos into habitable order. To budget is not merely to track numbers. It is to tell the truth about your limitations. To save is not merely to delay gratification. It is to vote for your future self rather than sacrifice him to your present impulses. To invest is not merely to seek return. It is to declare that you believe the future is worth preparing for. These are profoundly moral acts, not merely economic ones. When people are financially reckless, it is often because they are existentially reckless, because they have not articulated a vision of who they could become if they took responsibility seriously. And so they live as though the future were either irrelevant or hostile. Chaos thrives in that psychological vacuum. Bills go unopened, debts compound, opportunities are missed, and bitterness grows. Not because the individual is evil or stupid, but because avoiding responsibility provides short-term emotional relief at the cost of long-term catastrophe. The harsh truth is that order is effortful, and chaos is always waiting, always easier, always ready to reclaim territory the moment your vigilance lapses. But it is precisely in the act of pushing back against that chaos by setting your house in order, literally and metaphorically, that meaning emerges. Financial discipline, when properly understood, is not about becoming rich for the sake of status or pleasure. It is about becoming reliable, predictable, and trustworthy to yourself and others. And once you become someone who can be relied upon, value flows toward you almost inevitably, because value in a complex society is awarded to those who reduce uncertainty rather than amplify it. That is why money is not the problem. Chaos is. And the antidote to chaos is not hope, nor anger, nor envy, but the slow, sometimes painful, deeply meaningful assumption of responsibility, taken one truthful step at a time. If you really want to understand why chaos destroys people financially, you have to look deeper than spreadsheets and income charts and into the structure of the human psyche. Because money problems are very rarely money problems in isolation. They are manifestations of poorly aligned aim and unexamined habits that compound over years like interest in reverse. Human beings are goal-directed creatures, and when that goal structure is vague or corrupted, behavior deteriorates in subtle but devastating ways. If you do not know what you are aiming at, you cannot prioritize. And if you cannot prioritize, everything becomes equally important or equally meaningless, which is psychologically indistinguishable from paralysis. In that state, short-term impulses rule, not because people are weak, but because the nervous system is designed to prefer immediate certainty over abstract future reward. That's why spending money you don't have feels relieving in the moment. It temporarily reduces emotional pressure, while saving feels constricting, even punitive. But that relief is a lie. And it's a dangerous one, because it trains you to solve anxiety by borrowing from your future self, who is already burdened enough without inheriting your unpaid psychological debts. The disciplined individual, by contrast, learns to tolerate a certain amount of voluntary discomfort in the present so that the future can breathe. This is not repression, it is maturation. It is the same principle that allows a child to become an adult capable of sustaining a family, a career, and a stable identity. When you delay gratification intelligently, you are not denying yourself joy, you are organizing it across time so it doesn't collapse into chaos. And this is where responsibility enters in its most misunderstood form. Responsibility is not merely obligation imposed from the outside, it is the conscious decision to structure your life so that tomorrow is better than today. Financial responsibility, then, is a psychological contract between who you are now and who you could be if you stop sabotaging yourself. Most people never consciously sign that contract. They drift, they react, they blame. They wait for motivation to arrive like a rescue vehicle, when motivation is actually a byproduct of meaning, and meaning emerges only when you voluntarily accept a burden that justifies your suffering. If your financial life feels heavy and joyless, it may be because you are carrying chaos instead of responsibility, and chaos has no redemptive quality. It only exhausts you. Responsibility, however, strengthens you precisely because it gives your effort a direction. When you decide, for example, to track your expenses honestly, you are doing more than gathering data. You are confronting your own capacity for self-deception. When you choose to live below your means, you are not being deprived. You're building a margin of safety that allows you to tell the truth without fear. When you refuse to inflate your lifestyle, every time your income increases, you are asserting that your identity is not dependent on external validation. These decisions sound small, almost trivial. But psychologically, they are monumental, because they transform you from a passive victim of circumstance into an active participant in your own destiny. And that transformation changes how the world responds to you. Employers trust you more, opportunities reveal themselves, risk becomes calculable rather than paralyzing. This is not mystical, it is behavioral. Order attracts opportunity because order signals competence, and competence is rare. The uncomfortable implication of all this is that no one is coming to save you. And that realization can either crush you or liberate you, depending on whether you interpret it as abandonment or as an invitation to grow up. The moment you accept that your financial future is largely the cumulative result of your daily decisions, your habits, your honesty, your willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, you reclaim your agency. An agency, once reclaimed, is extraordinarily powerful, because it allows you to aim at stability, aim at competence, aim at becoming someone who does not collapse under pressure. When you do that, money ceases to be an obsession and becomes what it should have been all along, a tool for reducing unnecessary suffering so that you can pursue what actually matters. Once you have reclaimed that agency, something remarkable begins to happen, though it's rarely dramatic and almost never immediate. Your perception of time itself starts to change. People trapped in financial chaos live in what you might call an eternal present, where the future is either too vague to plan for or too frightening to contemplate. And so everything collapses into now. Now I need relief. Now I need comfort. Now I need distraction. That temporal collapse is catastrophic, because wealth, in its deepest sense, is the capacity to stretch the present into the future without it tearing apart. It is the ability to make a sacrifice today that reliably produces a benefit tomorrow, next year, or 10 years from now. That capacity is psychological before it is economic. You must believe that your future self exists, that he or she is worth protecting, and that your actions today can meaningfully improve that future. Many people don't fail financially because they lack knowledge. They fail because at some deep level, they do not trust themselves across time. They don't believe they will follow through, so they don't plan. Or worse, they plan grandly and act negligently, which is another form of self-betrayal. Every time you break a promise to yourself, whether it's about saving, spending, working, or learning, you weaken the internal structure that makes long-term planning possible. Eventually, you stop listening to your own intentions altogether. And when that happens, chaos doesn't just surround you, it inhabits you. Rebuilding that trust is painstaking, and it requires humility because you must start small enough that you can actually succeed. This is why grand financial fantasies are often counterproductive. They inflate the ego while bypassing the discipline required to sustain them. It is far better to aim at something modest and real, an emergency fund, a paid-off debt, a month of tracked expenses, and do it properly, honestly, and consistently. Success at that scale restores your confidence in your own word, and that confidence compounds just like interest, because each fulfilled promise strengthens the psychological machinery that allows you to make a larger one next time. Over time, your future stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like a partner. You begin to think in terms of trajectories rather than moments, patterns rather than impulses. This is when people often report a reduction in anxiety that has nothing to do with how much money they actually have. Order is calming, predictability is merciful. When you know where your money is going, you know where your life is going, at least to some degree. And that partial clarity is enough to quiet the nervous system. It frees cognitive resources that were previously consumed by worry and self-reproach. And those resources can then be applied to learning, to skill acquisition, to creative problem solving. This is another reason chaos is so expensive. It taxes your attention relentlessly. Financial disorder fragments your focus, and a fragmented mind cannot build anything of lasting value. By contrast, when you impose structure on your financial life, you are practicing a form of disciplined attention that generalizes outward. You become better at work because you are less preoccupied. You become more reliable in relationships because you are not constantly managing hidden crises. You become more resilient because setbacks are no longer existential threats, but temporary deviations from a stable path. And here's the crucial point. None of this requires extraordinary talent or privilege. It requires courage, the courage to look at what is, to tell the truth about it, and to act in alignment with that truth even when it is uncomfortable. That courage is the antidote to chaos, and it is available to anyone willing to accept the burden of responsibility without resentment. As that courage becomes habitual, you begin to notice a profound shift in how you relate not only to money, but to hierarchy, competence, and value itself. Because financial order has a way of clarifying where you actually stand in the world, stripped of comforting illusions and convenient excuses. This is unsettling for many people, because hierarchy has been unfairly maligned as nothing more than oppression, when in reality it is also a reflection of accumulated skill, reliability, and trust. In economic terms, people are rewarded not merely for effort, but for the degree to which their presence reduces chaos for others. A surgeon is paid well, not because society is greedy, but because when something goes catastrophically wrong inside your body, you want someone whose competence has been refined through years of disciplined sacrifice. The same principle applies in a quieter way to every domain of work. When your financial life is chaotic, it is often because your value proposition is unclear either to your employer, your clients, or even to yourself. And that lack of clarity is usually rooted in avoidance of deliberate practice, avoidance of feedback, avoidance of the uncomfortable truth that improvement requires sustained effort in a narrow domain over a very long period of time. People frequently chase income without chasing competence. And that is a fatal error, because income that is not grounded in real skill is unstable and anxiety-producing. It can disappear as quickly as it arrived, leaving behind not confidence but fear. By contrast, when you commit to becoming genuinely useful, to mastering something difficult enough that others are willing to exchange their hard-earned resources for your contribution, you anchor your financial life to something real. That anchor stabilizes you, because skills cannot be confiscated by market fluctuations in the same way speculative gains can. This is why the disciplined pursuit of competence is one of the most reliable paths out of financial chaos. It requires you to adopt a long-time horizon, to tolerate being mediocre for longer than your ego would prefer, and to submit yourself voluntarily to standards you do not yet meet. Psychologically, this is extraordinarily demanding, which is why so many people avoid it and instead drift toward fantasies of sudden wealth or external rescue. But fantasies do not organize behavior. Standards do. When you set a standard, whether it's in your profession, your finances, or your character, you create a measuring stick that allows you to improve incrementally rather than fluctuate emotionally. This has moral consequences as well as economic ones, because a person who knows what they are doing is less likely to lie, less likely to manipulate, and less likely to resent the success of others. Resentment, after all, thrives where competence is absent. It is much easier to declare the game rigged than to admit you have not yet learned how to play it well. But the cost of that self-deception is immense, because it locks you into a posture of perpetual victimhood, where growth feels like betrayal and responsibility feels like submission. Financial order demands the opposite posture, one of voluntary engagement with reality as it is, not as you wish it to be. When you accept that posture, hierarchy stops feeling like an enemy and starts functioning as feedback. You can see where you are lacking, not as a condemnation of your worth, but as a map for improvement. And once you have a map, you have hope, not the naive hope that things will magically improve, but the earned hope that comes from knowing exactly what to work on next. That kind of hope is powerful because it is grounded in action, not illusion. That grounded hope, once established, begins to radiate outward into every domain of life. Because when chaos retreats in one area, it rarely leaves the others untouched, and this is perhaps the most underappreciated aspect of financial responsibility. It teaches you how to live truthfully under constraint. Life is not a paradise of unlimited options. It is a narrowing corridor of choices, each one excluding 1,000 others, and money simply makes that reality explicit. When you budget, you are acknowledging finitude. When you save, you are negotiating with uncertainty. When you invest wisely, you are aligning yourself with the proposition that effort compounded over time produces something better than impulse ever could. These are not technical skills alone. They are existential stances. A person who has learned to live within financial limits without bitterness has learned something profound about the human condition, that freedom is not the absence of constraint, but the intelligent acceptance of it. This is why disciplined people often appear calmer, even joyful, not because their lives are easier, but because they are no longer at war with reality. They have stopped demanding that the world bend itself to their momentary desires and have instead shaped themselves to meet the world as it actually is. That alignment reduces internal friction, and reduced friction frees energy. With that energy, people begin to pursue higher order aims, contribution instead of consumption, legacy instead of status, meaning instead of mere pleasure. At that point, money finally finds its proper place, not as a god to be worshipped or a demon to be feared, but as a tool subordinate to values that are deeper and more durable than market cycles. The truly stable individual understands that wealth without character is just another form of chaos, one that corrodes relationships, inflates ego, and ultimately hollows out the soul. But character without competence is equally dangerous, because good intentions do not pay bills or feed families. What is required is their integration, responsibility married to skill, discipline guided by purpose. When you achieve even a partial integration of those elements, you become someone who can withstand shock, economic, emotional, or moral without disintegrating. And that resilience is no small thing in a world that is increasingly volatile and unforgiving. The final irony is this: the more you orient your life toward responsibility rather than reward, the more likely it is that reward will follow almost as a side effect. Not because the universe is conspiring to bless you, but because people who bring order where there was chaos are rare, and rarity is valuable. So if you are struggling financially, the most important question is not how to make more money, but how to become the kind of person who can handle it without being destroyed by it. That question leads you inward before it leads you upward, and it demands honesty before it promises relief. But if you are willing to take it seriously, to confront your own disorder without flinching, and to impose structure where none currently exists, you may discover that the problem was never money at all. It was chaos. And the moment you choose responsibility over resentment, order over avoidance, and meaning over impulse, you begin slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely to set the world right, starting with yourself.